I'm Charlotte.
And I'm Jonathan.
And we're in the Britain's Got Talent final. Nervous, excited.
Yeah, just a cocktail of emotions.
And it feels like, it actually feels really far away. It doesn't feel like it's tomorrow.
Jonathan Antoine is celebrated as the British Pavarotti, a tenor who conquered global charts with over 250,000 albums sold and earned standing ovations from legend Plácido Domingo. In 2012, he transfigured from a morbidly obese, trembling 17-year-old from Essex into a million-pound recording sensation on Britain's Got Talent. Yet, behind the thunderous applause and the fairytale success lay a harrowing, silent tragedy. For 13 years, starting at the tender age of 4, Jonathan was systematically broken by relentless bullying, finding his only medicine in self-harm and a desperate addiction to food. Even as his voice reached the heavens, his mind was spiraling into acute depression and a toxic romance that nearly cost him his life. Today, Jonathan finally peels back the curtain on a lifetime of undiagnosed autism and the hidden scars that never truly healed. This is not a story of overnight stardom. It is a shocking chronicle of a genius who had to bleed in private just to sing in public. A dark childhood. Bullied from the age of 4. Jonathan Antoine was born in January 1995 in Hainault, Essex. His father, John, worked as a police officer, and his mother, Tracy, was a housewife. While his home life was stable and supportive, his experience within the British school system was a 13-year nightmare. The systematic abuse began when Jonathan was only 4 years old, starting in nursery school and persisting without interruption until he left secondary school at age 17. The bullying was both physical and psychological. Peers frequently threw food at Jonathan in the cafeteria and mocked his physical appearance daily. He was subjected to total social isolation, with classmates refusing to sit near him or include him in any group activities. On numerous occasions, teachers discovered Jonathan hiding in empty classrooms or crying alone in corners of the schoolyard. He had no peer group to provide protection or friendship. To cope with this relentless hostility, Jonathan turned to food as a primary defense mechanism. He later described eating as his only painkiller to numb the emotional trauma. This created a destructive physical cycle. The more he was bullied about his size, the more he ate to self-soothe, leading to further weight gain and even more severe harassment. By his mid-teens, Jonathan was morbidly obese. His body became a physical manifestation of his internal suffering. In 2006, at the age of 11, Jonathan began vocal lessons with teacher Jenny Ewington. She immediately identified his rare tenor potential and encouraged him to pursue classical training. Music became his only sanctuary, a place where he felt a brief sense of control. However, even his emerging talent was used as a weapon against him. His peers did not call him by his name. Instead, they labeled him the fat kid who could sing. This nickname reinforced the idea that his worth was inseparable from his weight. The psychological impact of these 13 years was catastrophic. Jonathan developed profound self-loathing and a permanent state of hypervigilance, always bracing for the next attack. This prolonged trauma served as the root of the clinical depression that would surface later. Furthermore, the constant social friction masked the symptoms of his autism, which remained undiagnosed for decades. Educators dismissed his social difficulties and emotional outbursts as mere reactions to being bullied. When Jonathan eventually stood before the judges at Britain's Got Talent in 2012, he was not just a nervous teenager, he was a victim of long-term psychological warfare, carrying over a decade of unhealed wounds onto the world stage. Sudden fame, and the first wounds on the BGT stage. On March 24, 2012, Jonathan Antoine stepped onto the stage for his Britain's Got Talent audition alongside his singing partner, Charlotte Giaconelli. Before he sang a single note, Simon Cowell leaned toward the other judges and whispered, "Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, this comment, broadcast to millions, was the first public wound inflicted on Jonathan's professional life. It echoed the 13 years of bullying he had already endured, confirming his deepest fear that the world saw his physical appearance as a failure before they heard his talent. Despite the initial insult, their performance of The Prayer became a viral sensation. The video amassed over 7 million views in just a few days. However, global recognition brought a new form of trauma. While classical music critics praised his once-in-a-generation tenor voice, the tabloid press and social media users focused heavily on his weight. Jonathan was subjected to thousands of anonymous comments mocking his hygiene, his hair, and his size. For a 17-year-old already suffering from low self-esteem, this transition from private bullying to global scrutiny was overwhelming. The climax of this pressure occurred during the BGT final on June 9, 2012. Jonathan and Charlotte were the heavy favorites to win. Instead, they finished in second place, losing to a dancing dog act called Ashley and Pudsey. While Jonathan maintained a stoic expression on camera, he later described the physical sensation of that moment as feeling my internal organs sagging. He did not cry on television, but the loss reinforced a lifelong narrative that he was not good enough, even with a world-class talent. Despite coming in second, Simon Cowell offered the duo a £1.1 million recording contract with his label, Psycho. This success, however, came with immediate and exhausting demands. Jonathan was thrust into a schedule of 24/7 documentary filming, international press tours, and studio recording sessions. He was expected to be a perfect product for the classical crossover market. There was no time to process the transition from a bullied high school student to a millionaire celebrity. The weight of these expectations took an immediate toll. Within weeks of the BGT final, Jonathan began showing the first severe signs of clinical depression. He struggled to manage the sensory overload of large crowds and the intrusive nature of the paparazzi. The fairy tale of the £1 million contract quickly turned into a gilded cage by the time his first album was being prepared for release. Jonathan was already spiraling into a mental health crisis that would soon lead to a complete physical and emotional breakdown. Acute depression, self-harm, and the toxic romance. In 2012, within months of the Britain's Got Talent finale, Jonathan Antoine's mental health suffered a total collapse. Medical professionals diagnosed him with acute clinical depression. This was not a temporary state of sadness, but a debilitating medical condition that made daily functioning nearly impossible. The most significant consequence of this diagnosis was the forced cancellation of his debut performance at the Royal Albert Hall. For a classical singer, this venue is the pinnacle of a career. Yet Jonathan was physically and mentally unable to step onto the stage. During this period, Jonathan turned to self-harm as a survival mechanism. He later admitted in candid interviews that he began using sharp objects to cut his own skin. He described the act not as a desire to end his life, but as a way to quiet the noise in his head. The physical pain served as a grounding sensation, distracting him from the overwhelming anxiety of his sudden celebrity status and the lingering voices of his childhood bullies. These scars became a private, physical record of an internal war that the public, who saw only a success story, knew nothing about. At the age of 18, while still grappling with his diagnosis, Jonathan entered his first serious romantic relationship. However, the relationship quickly became toxic. His partner also suffered from severe, untreated mental health issues and frequently engaged in self-destructive behavior. Rather than finding a sanctuary, Jonathan found himself in a feedback loop of trauma. He later recounted instances where the partner would show him her own self-harm wounds or threaten self-destructive acts during arguments. Jonathan described this period as two broken people trying to fix each other but only making the cracks wider. The emotional labor of managing another person's crisis, while in the depths of his own depression, nearly ended his career before it had truly begun. Throughout this dark chapter, his family served as his only reliable support system. His father, John, his mother, Tracy, and his sister, Laura, were present at every recording session, every rehearsal, and every public appearance. They acted as a human shield, protecting him from the intrusive demands of the music industry and the press. Jonathan credited his family's constant presence as the reason he was able to fulfill his contractual obligations despite his mental state. Analysis of this period reveals that Jonathan's depression was not a celebrity illness caused by fame. Instead, it was the direct result of 13 years of suppressed trauma from school bullying, which the pressure of fame finally forced to the surface. He was a teenager with a world-class voice, but the emotional defense mechanisms of a child who had been told he was worthless since the age of 4. This phase of his life was the true nadir, where the voice that millions admired was almost silenced by the wounds that remained hidden from the spotlight. The breakup of the duo and the loss of his greatest friendship. Between 2012 and 2013, Jonathan Antoine and Charlotte Giaconelli achieved significant commercial success as a duo. Their debut album, Together, reached number 5 on the UK albums chart and sold over 150,000 copies. Their follow-up album, Perhaps Love, released in 2013, sold an additional 100,000 units. They were a global brand known to millions of followers as Jonathan and Charlotte, or the Fan Twins. During this period, they performed on major stages across Europe and appeared on national talk shows in the United States. In February 2014, the duo officially announced their separation. Sony Music offered them both solo recording contracts, which they chose to accept individually. The primary reason for the split was a fundamental difference in artistic direction. Jonathan wanted to pursue a career in pure classical opera. Charlotte preferred the world of musical theater. While the decision made professional sense, the personal cost for Jonathan was severe, despite their public image as inseparable friends. The professional split led to a total collapse of their relationship. Jonathan and Charlotte ceased all communication following the announcement. For more than 8 years, they did not speak, text, or meet in person. For Jonathan, this was not just a career change, it was the loss of his most significant social anchor. Charlotte had been the only person who stood beside him during the traumatic BGT auditions and the subsequent media frenzy. Her sudden absence from his life left a profound emotional void. Years later, Jonathan admitted that Simon Cowell's original assessment during their first audition was technically correct. Cowell had suggested Jonathan go solo from the start, stating that his voice was on a different level. While Jonathan eventually agreed with this musical evaluation, the realization brought its own form of internal conflict. He had defended Charlotte fiercely in 2012, yet by 2014, he was walking away from the partnership to pursue his own vocal potential. The transition to a solo artist was professionally successful, but psychologically isolating. Without a partner on stage, Jonathan's social anxieties intensified. He no longer had a companion to share the burden of performance or the stress of the spotlight. He achieved his first solo #1 album, Tenor, in late 2014, but he did so while navigating a deep sense of loneliness. The loss of his greatest friendship became another unhealed wound, reinforcing his struggle to maintain long-term social connections. Late autism diagnosis, the greatest tragedy of a life. In April 2022, shortly after his 27th birthday, Jonathan Antoine received a formal diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, ASD. This medical revelation was the most significant turning point in his adult life. Jonathan described the experience as recontextualizing my entire existence. For 27 years, he had lived with a profound sense of being broken, or alien, without understanding why. The diagnosis provided a clinical explanation for the social difficulties, sensory sensitivities, and emotional outbursts that had defined his journey since childhood. The tragedy of this late diagnosis lies in the 27 years of missed support. For nearly 3 decades, Jonathan's autistic traits were misinterpreted by teachers, peers, and the media. His intense, singular focus on operatic music was viewed merely as a hobby rather than a core part of his neurodivergent identity. His struggle to navigate social hierarchies in school was dismissed as awkwardness, making him an easy target for 13 years of relentless bullying. Jonathan realized that the trauma he endured was compounded because he lacked the cognitive tools to process the social malice directed at him. The diagnosis also shed new light on his experience with Britain's Got Talent. The high-pressure environment of live television, the bright stage lights, and the loud crowds were sensory nightmares for an undiagnosed autistic person. Jonathan recalled feeling a constant state of internal static during his rise to fame. Without knowing he was autistic, he blamed himself for his inability to act normal or handle the fame as easily as his peers. He had spent years masking, forcing himself to perform social neurotypicality, which led directly to his 2012 mental breakdown and subsequent clinical depression. On World Autism Awareness Day in April 2024, Jonathan went public with his diagnosis on Instagram. He shared a detailed post with his followers, explaining that he finally felt comfortable in his own skin. He began to view his autism not as a deficit, but as the source of his musical superpower. His ability to perceive pitch and emotion in music was linked to the same neurological wiring that made social interactions difficult. The late diagnosis allowed Jonathan to stop apologizing for his existence. He shifted his focus from trying to fix his personality to managing his environment. He began to advocate for neurodiversity, using his platform to speak about the importance of early screening. For Jonathan, the tragedy was the lost time and the unnecessary suffering of his youth. But the diagnosis offered a path toward a future where he no longer had to hide his true self. The weight loss journey and thyroid disease. Physical agony at his heaviest. Jonathan Antoine weighed approximately 280 pounds. This physical state was not merely a result of poor diet, but a direct consequence of his psychological trauma. For years, Jonathan used food as an emotional anesthetic to numb the pain of his childhood bullying. His body became a physical manifestation of his defense mechanisms. The more he was hurt, the more weight he put on to create a barrier between himself and the world. His struggle was further complicated by a diagnosis of thyroid disease, a condition that severely disrupts metabolism and energy levels. For someone with thyroid issues, weight management is not just difficult, it is a biological uphill battle. Despite this medical obstacle, Jonathan began a radical physical transformation in 2018. He chose a path of extreme, self-imposed discipline rather than surgical intervention. His primary method was deceptively simple, but required extraordinary willpower. Walking 10,000 steps every day. From 2018 to 2024, Jonathan maintained such a rigorous commitment that he reportedly only missed his 10,000-step target twice in several years. This consistency was a form of positive penance, replacing his previous habits of self-harm with a regime of self-improvement. He also completely overhauled his relationship with food, transitioning from using it as a painkiller to treating it as fuel for his vocal performances. The results were transformative. Between 2018 and 2024, Jonathan lost between 70 and 120 pounds. By the time he reached his late 20s, he had shed nearly a third of his body mass. However, the significance of this weight loss was more psychological than aesthetic. Jonathan described the process as reclaiming the body that had been stolen by bullies. This journey was often physically agonizing due to his thyroid condition and the strain of his performance schedule. Yet, every pound lost represented a victory over the fat kid persona that his school peers had forced upon him. By gaining control over his weight, Jonathan was finally asserting dominance over his own narrative. His body was no longer a cage of trauma, but a finely tuned instrument for his world-class voice. This physical evolution was a visible sign that while his wounds were deep, his capacity for discipline and self-care was even deeper. The present, 2026. Tragedy accepted, but not ended. As of early 2026, Jonathan Antoine has transformed from a victim of circumstances into a deliberate architect of his own life. On March 27, 2026, he released his highly anticipated studio album, Speaking to You, following the critical success of his 2024 project Christmasland and the popular single All of Me. With a net worth estimated at $4 million and a consistent schedule of international tours, Jonathan has achieved a level of financial and professional security that seemed impossible during his teenage years. However, the tragedy of his life has not vanished. It has been integrated. Jonathan continues to manage clinical depression and the daily sensory and social challenges of his late-diagnosed autism. He no longer views these as illnesses to be cured, but as permanent aspects of his identity that require constant, disciplined management. The 10,000-step daily walks continue, and his relationship with food remains a strictly controlled discipline rather than an emotional escape. Jonathan has expanded his influence beyond the opera house. He is now an active author of children's books, specifically writing stories that teach young readers how to identify, resist, and report bullying. He serves as a prominent public advocate for neurodiversity, often speaking at health conferences about the critical importance of early autism screening. His goal is to ensure that no other child has to wait 27 years to understand why they feel different. Now, 31 years old, Jonathan describes himself as finally comfortable in his own skin for the first time in his life. He no longer hides his self-harm scars or masks his autistic traits to please a neurotypical public. The biographic arc of Jonathan Antoine is not a story of a happy ending where all wounds have disappeared. Instead, it is a factual account of a man who accepted his scars and learned to sing through them. The tragedy remains a part of his history, but it no longer dictates his future.